This podcast is produced by the Fireside Chat Club of Canada.
Hello, and welcome to Canada as I See It. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. This week is special. I've been doing this podcast for over 9 months, and just a couple of weeks ago, I received the first email. Indeed, the first contact with someone I did not know. And they wanted to know a little bit more about what I spoke about several weeks ago. Thank you, Vladimir, for introducing the show this week. One of the subjects that Vladimir wanted to know a bit more about was the First Nations history in Ontario. As you all know, I can tend to be a bit wordy, so I'll hold off on the other request for a future podcast. The Fireside Chat Club of Canada acknowledges that the land that this podcast is being recorded on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The Wendat peoples settled into southern Ontario along the Aramosa River, and that's in the Guelph area, just a little southwest from where I am, around 8,000 to 7,000 BCE. There are a couple of ways to interpret that. BCE is most commonly known as before Common Era, or before Christian Era, meaning any time after that is when we started counting the years that we know now. So essentially, you're adding 2,024 years onto those numbers. And that means that the Wendat people settled in southern Ontario over 10,000 years ago. And they were primarily concentrated between Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay, a little bit further north. Let's break this down a little. As I said that, I'm reminded of the grandfather in that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. You know, he could give you the origin of any word and guarantee that it was Greek. This is much the same thing, actually. Give me a place name, well, not just in Ontario, but in most of Canada, and there's a very high probability that it comes from an Indigenous word. And that is more the rule rather than the exception. And, well, speaking of exceptions, let's get that out of the way right now. I mentioned Guelph. Guelph, the etymology, comes from the Italian Guelfo, from the Middle High German Welf, a Bavarian dynasty. Now moving on, the word we're looking at is Aramosa. The name Aramosa was derived from the native word Unemosa, possibly meaning black dog, dead dog, or, well, just simply dog. Ontario, well, that comes from the Huron word Ontario, meaning beautiful lake, or Canadario, meaning sparkling or beautiful water. And please, if I'm mispronouncing any of these words, let me know. Please email me as I see it at warpole.ca, WHORPOLE.ca. Heaven knows that there have been many, many different pronunciations of my surname. So if you do know a little more accurate sound for those words, please, as I said, let me know. So language is actually a very important thing when it comes to the First Nations people and the interaction with the Europeans who came over here. I've always tried to use words carefully when speaking and writing. And, well, I've sometimes caused friction when I've used a word properly, in quotes, and due to its colloquial meaning, it was taken in conflict. This subject matter of language is, well, where we can all learn more about the Aboriginal peoples, the First Nations, and, yes, Indians. Although I must caution you, this is a term that is only used in very specific situations, and frankly, I would advise against it unless you're absolutely sure of the context. Though treaties have been signed between the Europeans and the First Nations people, while speaking of language, there have been many attempts by the colonialists over the years to control and indeed conquer the native people of Canada and Ontario. Residential schools was one of those ways. They were put in place by the early Canadian government to essentially assimilate Indigenous people, stripping them of their language and culture. Recently, although not soon enough, measures have been put into place to educate people and make known the atrocities that were perpetrated against them. I'll have more information on this subject, actually, for you at the end of the summer, as the Day of Truth and Reconciliation comes around in late September. So, I was talking about language, and let's look at the word Huron. That is the name of one of the Great Lakes in the southern Ontario region, and where Georgian Bay branches off from. The Huron-Wendat made their way from Georgian Bay down to Lake Simcoe. It's about 90 minutes north of Toronto, where I am, and then east in 1650 after the destruction of their homeland by the Haudenosaunee. The name Huron was actually given to the Wendat by the French, and it means boar's head, which, well, refers to the hairstyle of the Wendat men. Once again, language comes up, and there are many names like, well, Huron and Iroquois that are slowly being, well, discarded and returned to what they used to be known as prior to the influence of the European settlers. Wendat and Haudenosaunee are now the preferred names of these people. There is a lot of space between 8000 BCE and 1650 AD, and I don't mean to gloss over it, but as you go through each period in history, each name, each location, each person you touch on, it opens up a huge tree of information. Well, that's several university credits long. The best I can do is, well, give you the highlights and encourage you to research what strikes you. It started out with the Wendat, but now there are many different nations, and a lot of them that are there today in Ontario have come from splits and consolidations of other nations through the years. Another point on language, actually, First Nations, which I've spoken of a lot, is actually one of three groupings of Indigenous people in Canada and Ontario, the other two being Métis and Inuit, again, which I've spoken about before. Unlike Métis and Inuit, most First Nations hold reserve lands, and members of a First Nation may live both on and off these reserves. While the term First Nations can describe a large ethnic grouping, for example, the Mohawk Nation, in other cases it's synonymous with the term band. And that's a word originally chosen by the federal government and used in the Indian Act. And the word band describes smaller communities within those nations. Many First Nations actually prefer First Nation over band. Indeed, even First Nations and Indigenous are words that are preferred, or not, between the many communities that live in the land we know as Ontario. This land is home to 133 First Nations communities, representing at least 7 major cultural and linguistic groups. And Ontario is home to 23% of all Indigenous peoples in Canada. I've tried to be succinct, but as you can tell, the information runs so deep that to try and lay all of that out in what is normally a 10-minute podcast would be, quite impossible. One of Vladimir's other requests was a background on the history of Ontario. Well, to be frank, I covered a lot of it today, but I may just look at the origin and the geographic side of the province. I asked him to give me a couple of weeks for part 2, but I will definitely let you know when that's coming up. I want to thank everyone for listening today. It's a little departure from my usual chat, not nearly as humorous or joking as I usually am, but this is not a subject really to joke about. If you'd like to know more, indeed, I'm going to open up the book here. If you'd like to know more about any subject that I do talk about, please let me know, because this in itself was, even though I do know a good amount of the history of Ontario, I did do a little bit of research, and I did in fact learn quite a bit, a lot of which really I could not relate to you today. It might involve me starting to teach a course, perhaps. Who knows? If you would like to get involved in the podcast and introduce it, like Vladimir did today, please send me a recording of you saying, "This podcast is produced by the Fireside Chat Club of Canada." And you can email that to me at asiseeit@warpole.ca. That's WHORPOLE.ca. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and I'll talk to you again next week. And that's a part of Canada as I see it. It is written and produced by me, James Warpole, and brought to life by the Fireside Chat Club of Canada. Our theme song is Night Owls by Brayden Deal. If you have any questions or comments, please email me at asiseeit@warpole.ca. Join us every Sunday for another episode of Canada as I See It.